the inspiration and research that went into creating it. As he mentioned, I've titled it From Presentation to Page and Back Again because it was inspired by a talk from NACIS 2018 by Jeff Ferzoco. This was his talk called The New LGBT Neighborhood. And if you didn't see his presentation last year, I highly recommend you check it out on YouTube. But Riley and I were both there, and we left the talk very inspired, and we just thought that it would be a great data set. Oh, sorry, just to go into it a little bit, what his talk was about was his interactive web mapping platform and data collection that he had created for called OutgoingNYC. And this is an interactive crowdsourced map that is showing the location of LGBTQ nightlife in New York City over the past century or so. The map that we made was featured in a section of the National Geographic magazine. It was published in June of this year. And it's a section called Atlas, which is featured in the front of our magazine. And it's a place where we always like to use maps and data as the focal point of our storytelling, just on 1 or 2 pages, but a place where we can highlight a really interesting topic. And so after seeing Jeff's talk, Riley and I we kind of went up to each other right afterwards and were like, whoa, this would be really great to feature. We chatted with Jeff about it quickly, and he was gung-ho. So one of the questions you might be asking is, why recreate this map? And because it was going to be in the magazine, it was going to be a static map versus the interactive that he made. But really, our impetus was to, of course, just share this amazing data set with a wider audience. And in the back of my mind, I knew that the timing would be pretty good too, because this year, 2019, was the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riots. World Pride was going to be happening in New York City, and as it worked out, with our production schedule, it could actually be featured in the June issue, June being Pride Month in the US. So that was all well and good. And personally, myself, last year, this was a tweet I sent out because from the keynote last year, we always take away something inspiring from all the keynotes. And one of the things they talked about last year was collaboration. And that's something that I found really important in all of my projects, is that when I'm working on a team, I just do a lot better. So I was looking to collaborate and had some coworkers that were happy to do that too. So we went back to DC and we had a quick call with Jeff to talk about some ideas, and he gave us some thoughts and also provided the data set to us. So we started doing some quick mock-ups here, which you can see. So this is us just kind of throwing things on the wall to see what sticks. You can see we played around a lot with layout. Most of the locations are, of course, located on the island of Manhattan, so that's where the focus really was. But there were some places in outer neighborhoods of the boroughs, so, and we also kind of experimented with focusing on the Greenwich Village area. These are just a bunch of different prototypes that we took to our editors to kind of do our initial pitch and approval. And we got the green light from them that, yeah, this would be a great thing to feature in the magazine. So that was getting to be about December, so coming into the holiday break. And I knew that would be a good time, at least for myself, to dig into the topic a little more. Oh, and I should mention that the team at National Geographic was made up of myself, Riley Champagne, who is moderating this session, and our colleague Ryan Williams. I kind of dealt with the data side. Riley did a lot of the initial design, and Ryan was text and research. And then, of course, Jeff was our kind of expert, not only in the data, but also in just the subject matter. So we all kind of worked together on that. And Jeff, because he had already done so much research himself, was able to recommend some great resources for us. The main one being the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project, which was also doing some mapping in the same topic. They were kind of more refined than Jeff's map because Jeff's data set was very extensive. It's a crowdsourced project, so along with scraping a lot of data himself, he was gathering data from any volunteers. The point of NYC LGBT historic sites is actually to attain historic preservation status for various sites across the city. So they, of course, have a more limited number of sites that they are representing, but they have an extensive amount of research and history about them. So that was just really cool to read about and to just get more information. The National Park Service had also done a really interesting heritage theme study on LGBTQ life in America. They did that in lead up to the centennial in 2016, and the big result of that, of course, was the turning of the Stonewall Inn into a national monument. So both of those were really interesting to read and give some just further background. He also recommended a number of kind of more media-centered things. The book on the left, Gay New York, is by George Chauncey, who is a well-known he's a professor and an expert on gay life in New York. And this book was solely about life from the 1890s to the 1940s. And it was a tome, and it was full of some really interesting facts, just shedding light on the history there. I also listened to a number of podcasts, and such as this one called Making Gay History by Eric Marcus, which features a lot of interviews with people who were involved in the early gay rights movement. They are also featured in this amazing documentary I got to see called Gay Pioneers, which actually talks about a lot of those people prior who were doing civil disobedience and things like that prior to Stonewall. And it just really puts in perspective, this was a time when, as Jeff had mentioned, being out meant you couldn't work for the federal government. There was a lot of prejudices that went into that, and they were just, this was an actual picket sign that they were using during their kind of peaceful demonstrations, where they were expressing that, they were just trying to be perceived as normal, to be accepted in society, which is pretty crazy. As a gay cartographer growing up in the 90s and 2000s, it's pretty crazy to reflect back on this history and just to kind of get a sense of the work that these people and the prejudice that they had to deal with. Nothing more can be, I think, summed up in this amazing episode by This American Life called 81 Words, and it talks about how up until sometime in the 1970s, homosexuality was defined as a mental illness, and talks about the work that actually a lot of psychiatrists within the EPA themselves, a lot of them were actually closeted, and they were working to remove it from their manual. So really, really interesting stuff. Probably one of the more personal things for me was being able to go and visit this place, the Lesbian History Archives. This is literally a brownstone in Brooklyn, full of material, as I say, by and about lesbian life. I'd heard about it, and it worked out that that's Jeff there with myself and my 1-year-old son at the time, and we were able to kind of go there over the holidays and kind of comb through the archives. And it's really amazing. We did a little hands-on research there because, as Jeff pointed out, and he knew, a lot of the research materials that he had used to create his database was scraping gay guides or various books. And a lot of that formalized life was definitely more focused on the male gay experience and less so on the lesbian experience. And so it was really interesting to see, we've got literally hand-drawn little invitations to parties and events happening, little hand-drawn maps locating where they were going. They also just have lots of other stuff there, a bunch of pins. These are a couple t-shirts that I thought were really cool. I was glad to see they had a good appreciation for maps. I might have to put that "We Are Everywhere" map into the NACIS t-shirt design, I don't know. But there were also some really kind of heavy things. This newspaper clipping I came across that gays urge to change sexual preference, just really hit home about just what life was like in the past century, things like that. And all this just put into context everything, the data, and helped me to think about our project in a bigger context. So we came back in the new year, refreshed and working on refining our design. You can see here that we're starting to kind of still play around with the layout. I apologize for the washed outness, but you can see here we were already, the colors and that stuff that we were pretty sure that we wanted to stick with a similar kind of dark nightlife look that Jeff had used. And here we weren't still sure if we were going to have a 2-page or a 1-page spread. We always, of course, go in trying for more real estate. It was determined, though, that we were only going to get 1 page, so then we worked to distill our information down to 1 page. And again, it doesn't really show through here, but you can see actually on the far right, one of the bigger things we were working on was deciding, again, on the layout. The true north is actually the rotated kind of Manhattan there, and then when we rotated the view 27 degrees, you get the kind of straight up and down Manhattan, which we were kind of liking at first, but then we determined that keeping it at true north actually gave a nice little spot in the corner for our key to sit in. So we actually stuck with that layout. And you can see that we're also playing with the histogram and starting to throw some notes on there, which I'll go into a little more. I don't know if this is gonna play. Yeah, so at the top left there, you can see I did just a little screen grab. One of the more, when going from an interactive map to a static map, we of course knew we were gonna have to make some design decisions. The biggest thing that I thought was great from Jeff's map was being able to see the temporal nature of the places, of the nightlife locations and the proliferation of them over time, and then how there were very few at the beginning of the 20th century, how they really expanded in the 60s, 70s, and then kind of in the 80s, and then 80s and 90s they started dropping down again. So we knew we definitely wanted to give, to be able to show that temporalness of the data. So we were playing around with the histogram here. This bottom left black one is kind of the first layout we had, and you can see that's corresponding to the top key up there. So along with the time, we were also trying to figure out how we wanted to break that time down. First, we just did it in increments. The earliest point is from 1859, which is pretty amazing. So we first just broke it down into kind of equal 40-year increments. But after kind of doing a lot of the research, we noticed that there were actually touchstones in the years, cultural touchstones that actually kind of made a little more sense to break the data up with. And so on the right, you can see there, those are the times periods that we settled on: before 1950, 50 to 79, 80 to 1999, and the 2000s and above. One thing that in all the research that I thought was really interesting was kind of prior to the 1950s, prior to the World Wars, we tend to think now of like, we have the most, maybe people are more aware of gender, gender fluidity, and things like that. But actually, prior to the World Wars, there was actually a lot more, or a lot less rigidity in those terms that were used. It kind of, I was really surprised to learn about that, and it was only the actions kind of just after the World Wars when life got a little more rigid culturally, especially for homosexuals, but just in culture in general. So that's why we had broken up those kind of eras. But then, of course, there was leading up. The 50s, of course, was, as I mentioned earlier, was a time where there was a lot less acceptance of being gay in culture, in federal government, but then that kind of led to a head in the 60s and 70s. As we all know, 1969, along with the Stonewall riots, was a very important time in the US in general and culture, and that kind of started that spark of people resisting oppression. And then in the 80s, you of course have the tragedy of the HIV/AIDS crisis, which was just really galling to read about, how drastically it affected that community. And of course, as Jeff also had touched upon in his talk, with the rise of technology in the early 2000s, that kind of definitely changed the aspect of needing to go out to a specific brick and mortar place. And so that's why there has been kind of a downshift, that and many reasons, in informal locations where people meet. So we started again just refining the colors, the locations of notes, the locations of the histogram. We can go into greater detail about these little refinements later on. I apologize, it doesn't look great on the screen here, but the real narrative came in these notes, these 7 or 8 notes that are spread across the page. And it was an interesting test in editing, because how do you fit into a little nutshell over 100 years of history. But we also tried, along with having information about the spread of the data and the time, we wanted to kind of also touch on the geography of the page. So you'll see I've kind of highlighted them on the right, but we have a nice spread starting at the north. The data pretty much was on the island of Manhattan up until Central Park. And so we have spots up there, the Ramble up in Central Park, going down. And seeing kind of the geographic spread over time of these locations was really interesting. And also, of course, like where they were always centralized. Greenwich Village was then and is now still a kind of centralized heart of the gay community in New York. One of the really cool, interesting tidbits that I feel like maybe that came about because of a lot of the research we had done beforehand was just focusing on, in Brooklyn, there's a few spots. It doesn't seem significant really by volume of places, but we were able to know that, it was culturally important because in World War II, that was where a lot of factories were located, and a la Rosie the Riveter, a lot of women came there from across the country to work in those factories, and a lot of times that was the first place they were living independently, meeting people who were similar to them. The reason that there's kind of a lack, we know that there's a lack of female representation in this data just because historically, and even now, women have less earning income, less ability to go out and spend that money in a formal setting. So we put in a little note about that, and that was really, I think that was really important to include. So I'm just going to finish up with saying, like everything else, representation matters for this project, including, if we include Jeff in our team of 4, 3/4 of us identify as gay. We had, Riley as our token straight person, which, isn't often what you have, but he lent a very important perspective to the history. I was able to go up to New York for World Pride in June, visit the Stonewall Inn and the National Monument there. And on the far right is a picture of my friends and I. We were walking down to the parade and we stumbled across Julius, which is the oldest gay bar still in existence in New York City, and also the location of one of the more important acts of civil disobedience prior to Stonewall. So it was just really cool to be able to have all this education about this really important topic. So just want to say thanks to Riley, Ryan, Jeff, the experts we spoke to, the volunteers at these locations, and all of you. Thank you.